Okay, so we decided to do our project on wind and solar energy in Nebraska, focusing on how to increase that. We found that the current energy consumption in Nebraska was about 872 trillion BTUs in 2013. We got that information from the Energy Information Administration, which reports on state energy data. Uh, Consumption by fuel source yielded 17.2 trillion for wind, which made up 2% of total consumption. Solar was 0.1 trillion, which made up 0.01% of total consumption. And from there, we also looked at some other fuel types such as nuclear, hydroelectric, and petroleum. For renewables, we found that our wind consumption, about 53% of it was generated in Nebraska, totaling about 9.5 trillion BTU. The other 47% came from other states such as Oklahoma and South Dakota, totaling 7.7 trillion BTU. Solar is very minimal. Currently, it's zero point 0.8 megawatts with an additional 5 megawatts being constructed this summer. The other, uh, we also converted some of those units into gigawatts per hour, and those are the units we see here. All sources came again from the Energy Information Administration.
Nebraska has a lot of opportunity to increase its wind and solar. For its wind energy, Nebraska is actually ranked fourth in the nation for energy potential in wind. So, at speeds, wind speeds at 80-meter heights, which is the height of a wind turbine, need to be greater than 6.5 meters per second. And based on the graph there, the majority of the state is from 7 to 8 meter per second wind speeds, so it has a lot of potential for good wind energy. And it also has a lot of open space for turbines and wind farms. There are also lots of opportunities for solar energy. Nebraska is ranked 13th in the nation for solar. And this is based on the sun index, which is this chart you see here. And that's calculated by the average hours of peak direct sunlight per year. Currently, Nebraska doesn't have any solar farms yet, but there's currently one under construction. It's the Holder Solar Center, and it will be producing about 5 megawatts as of June 2016. There are also good opportunities because of Nebraska's location in the United States. Because it has a central location, it has access to many of the wind and solar manufacturers. Interstates run through the state, so you can reach all wind manufacturers by truck in about 2 days. Along with opportunities, you're also going to have limitations, and there are quite a few limitations for the state. One of them is that there are small populations where there is the most potential for wind energy. So you have a lot of energy available, but no demand for it, which means that we'd have to build many more transmission lines from wind farms to get the electricity to where it's demanded. And even though there's lots of land space, not all of the land is available to use. There are regulations on the distance from houses and roads that wind turbines need to be, and there are also protected wildlife areas that we have to keep in mind. Not only that, but wind and solar are unreliable energy resources. You can't predict the wind and the clouds, so you would need to have backup sources for energy when there's a high demand and you can't supply all of that. And so most people would look to natural gas for that. You also have the public opinion to deal with, especially with residential renewable energy sources you implement, like solar panels and whatnot. And they also have a good pull on what the state decides to do. So problems like noise and aesthetics, that they think wind turbines don't look good, has an effect. And the noise actually caused Lancaster County to put regulations on the amount of decibels that can be produced from wind turbines. And it was at a low enough number that it discourages further development from companies. Because Nebraska has public power, the Power Review Board that makes all the decisions on where our energy comes from, they usually approve the lowest cost and most reliable energy, and because wind and solar are not the lowest cost, and definitely not reliable. It's been slowing how much we adopt this new energy.
Okay, so in order to find out how we could increase wind power in the state of Nebraska, we did research on finding how much current uh, wind energy there was in Nebraska. We found that there was 812 megawatts being produced, and that's every year, and that there was 475 wind turbines producing a total of the 812. We also did research to find out that the average turbine costs between $3 to $4 million. So we averaged that number out and got 3.5 million. From there, we divided 812 megawatts divided by 475 turbines to get 1.7 megawatts per turbine. From there, we took that number times 3.5 million for each turbine we planned on having. So that's where we get these numbers here. It's to increase the total wind energy uh, generation in Nebraska, you would need an additional 475 wind turbines. That number times 3.5 million gets us 1.6 billion dollars. Or excuse me, yeah, 1.6 billion dollars. To increase by 50%, we just have those numbers and we get an increase of 406 megawatts with 833 million dollars and 238 wind turbines. And finally, to increase by 25%, we get an additional 203 megawatts at $416.5 million and 117 wind turbines. For solar power, we researched and found that the average solar panel generates about 250 watts and cost, and they are usually installed in groups of 5 kilowatt projects. The average 5 kilowatt project costs about $30,000. So in order to find out how to increase solar power by 800 kilowatts, we had to divide 800 kilowatts divided by 5 kilowatts per project. So we got 160 projects. Then we took that number times the average the average cost of installation, which was 30,000, and 160 times 30,000 equals 4.8 million. From there, once again, we just had to have the numbers. So an increase of 50% yields 400 kilowatts, costing $2.4 million with 80 projects, and an increase by 25% yields 200 kilowatts, costing $1.2 million with 40 projects. And these projects are generally the average size. A 5 kilowatt project is the average size of a home installation. So if a company were putting in 5 projects, that would be about 150,000 and yield 25 kilowatts.
The type of technology that's available affects our calculations, and it changes our numbers quite a bit. And some new technology that's coming out with solar are organic photovoltaics. And these have carbon compounds in them, and those compounds are made into structures that have specific functions. So, for example, the structure would allow it to absorb certain wavelengths of light. This technology is a lot better than our typical solar panels we have now. There are a lot of reasons for that. Because it's made of carbon compounds, it's a lot more flexible and lighter weight. So it has the ability to be used on a lot of different things. So not just rooftops, but other smaller devices as well. It also has a much lower manufacturing cost. And you can also make these different colors as well. So they can be used in like windows and things like that.
All right, so the feasibility with technology, we kind of came to terms and realized that it's not too reasonable with the costs. We mentioned earlier how it's not the most reliable energy source, so it is hard to back public opinion to afford all of these projects. In order to find out how much it costs per megawatt in Nebraska, we took our overall overall amount of 812 megawatts for wind energy and divided that by 1.6 billion, and we got 1.97 million for 1 megawatt of power. And for solar, we did the same thing. We took our overall solar generation using $1.6 billion on solar. That number came out to be 270 megawatts, and 270 megawatts divided by 1.6 billion divided by 270 megawatts came out to $5.93 million per megawatt. So between the two, the solar is, of course, the more expensive, um, but it is easier to install for homeowners. It's more realistic for homeowners. But in general, increasing wind energy and solar energy by anything over 25% is a little bit too expensive and costly currently for the state of Nebraska. Uh, that also plays in the factor that for wind farms, you can't really build those in residential areas. You do need a high amount of land. The 80% of the cost of a wind turbine comes from the roads and the installation. The other 20% is on the actual wind turbine. Uh, so wind turbines aren't exactly for residential use. Um,